I think it's really wrong to label a child with any kind of sexual orientation label or trans type of label. They're too young to make either of those decisions. And again, the research has pointed out, and Dr. Lisa Diamond has pointed out, that the only way to know if somebody's same-sex attractions in their youth will linger into their adulthood is to just wait and find out if that actually happens.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Debra Baty. She has a fascinating, interesting story, as well as some activism and a lot of current relevant comments on a Supreme Court case. And so we're going to have an interesting talk, and I look forward to it. So, Debra, welcome.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So, first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself and your story.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, became a Christian at a young age, and around 13 or so started realizing that I was attracted to women in ways that seemed a little different than others around me, and took time to just sort through that. This was back in the dark ages before the internet, so I did not have um, resources, or there wasn't even anything in the library. And that's kind of wild now. You walk into a library and sometimes you're inundated with rainbow flags and stuff.
Yeah.
um, it's so different now, but I had no way to sort through what I was feeling. I read the scripture. I'm thankful now with some of that because I didn't have propaganda thrown at me. I spent time with the Lord in His Word and kind of studied on my own. I didn't have a church that was talking about sexuality or gender type things at all. So that was it was lonely, but I'm also thankful I didn't have bad preaching thrown at me, scapegoating people who happened to experience this temptation. So, but I realized that this was not part of the way that the Lord wants us to live. So I looked for a long time to try to find some kind of solid counseling. I'd heard just rumors of anything I'd heard about kind of counseling seemed really wacko. And I just didn't, I was afraid of going to secular counseling for a long time. And finally, when I was in grad school, I went to a church and they had a ministry of the week that they prayed for in their bulletin. And I still have that bulletin because the ministry of the week was Harvest USA. And they helped people with unwanted same-sex attraction or other sexual addiction or issues. And I was just thrilled to find that, and I thought, let me check this out. It was really funny because I went and I was hoping to just get one-on-one counseling, and they encouraged me to join their support group. I said, well, if I can check out the person in charge of the support group, maybe I'll consider it. And they said, oh, sure, we can arrange that. And I didn't realize that they had a screening interview as one of the qualifications for being in the support group anyway. So they were very nice to me in that. But I found the support group to be incredible, very beneficial. No one there promised me that my attractions would change, but we just had a good in-depth time of breaking down different aspects of our lives that could possibly impact our sexuality, and had a safe environment where we could ask questions, or you could just keep quiet if you wanted to. You could pray with people if you wanted to. If you didn't, that was fine too. And we just explored different areas of relationships and aspects of life. And then I found about 8 years later, after I went on to some individual counseling when I moved and went on with life, but about 8 years later, I started experiencing a change in my attractions, started becoming attracted to men. And about 10 years after that, I met the man I'm married to now, and just found that I wouldn't change, looking back, the toughness of experiencing, just wrestling with that, my sexuality in those way between my sexuality and my faith. I wouldn't change that because I learned so much about who God is and how good He is, His comfort and His guidance. I developed a real intimacy with the Lord through that experience that I cherish. I learned about myself, and I'm just in relationships. It was hard, but I'm very thankful of how things have turned out. So I've been curious, after having such a good experience with counseling, I've been curious as to why there's such a push against counseling in this area of anyone that has unwanted same-sex attraction is not able to get, or it's really hard to find good counseling because the APA has mandated affirmation only as the approach.
So I want
So
to jump in real quick. What I've learned from all of my years studying psychology and currently in my master's of counseling program, the accepted wisdom pretty much universally is that changing sexual orientation and changing attraction patterns is impossible. And what you're telling me is that's not been the case for you.
correct. And what's been found in the research, what I've seen is that this area has been terribly unstudied. The research is really lacking because it's not surprising to come to conclusions like that when you've not really studied it. So people like myself who've experienced fluidity in our orientation or interactions, I don't really give much credence to orientation as a framework through my experience in part, but also through the things I've studied. I don't think it holds up theologically, philosophically, or scientifically, and I can explain that. But, you can't describe or talk about people that have experienced fluidity when you've never studied or tried to find people like myself. But I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Lisa Diamond.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so her work in 2008, she has described herself as a lesbian. She was doing a longitudinal study of a group of women around 2008, 2013. 5 years in, they all described themselves as lesbian. 5 years in, she, comes back and checks on them. And several of them said, I'm now married to a man, or I'm now attracted to men. Something must be wrong with me because I thought I was a lesbian all this time. And she was like, interesting. And these are secular women, not interested in experiencing, they have no motivation to seek change. They just happen to find that they're now in love with men. So she did a lot more digging into research of 10,000 to 40,000 people in, major studies.
It's a
She's
very
looking
large
back at,
sample size.
yeah, she wasn't, yeah, exactly. Significant sample size. And she wasn't necessarily, she was doing that. She was looking back at studies the US had done or University of Michigan and that kind of stuff and kind of combed back through the data and looked at longitudinal 10 years or more, what people said about their sexual behaviors, identity, and desires or attractions, and found that fluidity was the norm. It was hard to find somebody that was consistently experiencing same-sex, like exclusive same-sex attractions were really rare. More so in women than men. Like it's more common for men to experience exclusive same-sex attraction, but the percentage was like 2% of among people that experience same-sex attraction. And again, this is across a lifetime. But the more digging she did, the more she realized this whole framework isn't, once gay, always gay, isn't showing up over the long term. So that threw things for quite a loop. And she did several TED Talks. She's written books, and she's talked about feeling guilty for like, have I overturned the framework, that we've built gay rights on?
Hmm.
But she continues to hold to the sexual orientation framework. I think she kind of considers it, if you have the capacity to be same-sex attracted, that means that's who you really are. So that's your true sexual orientation, no matter how often you experience it or act it out or whatever. And
Hmm.
to me, I'm like, that's when you're jumping ship from a scientific observation to a philosophical or theological claim. When you're
So tell
saying,
me, tell me about how you say you reject the concept of orientation. Tell me what you mean by that.
yeah, I have a couple quotes. There's a guy named Mark Hannon who put it way, Michael Hannon, who wrote an article in 2013 who put it way more eloquently than I could, but I resonate with this. He says, this is in an article in a um, online magazine called First Things. And he said, ultimately, the empirical problem with the sexual orientation framework we've been handed is that it is too neat, that it works by oversimplifying an incredibly messy web of attractions and drives and temptations, and that it inhibits the taming of those desires by improperly amplifying their significance.
Would you describe this as like a fluidity as opposed to something concrete? Would you say it's a choice? Like how would you kind of
Yeah, that's a great question. Not, Dr. Lisa Diamond does not believe that change in orientation can be facilitated through counseling. So she's adamant, like among all her work, and she's observed this fluidity, but she does not believe that any kind of counseling would ever help someone achieve that. I say that the evidence is not significant to back that up because it's not, the quality of research is pitiful according to the APA's own ranking of the quality of the research. There's studies just were not scientifically rigorous at all. So if you're doing basically survey type data, you can't make that kind of claim. Like there's no validity, there are biased samples, there's all kind of problems. So anyway, but your question was, what degree is choice involved? And that's still a mystery. It's very different for different individuals. There is a great resource that I recommend, a meta-analysis done by, do you know Paul McHugh, Dr. Paul McHugh,
I don't think so.
John Hopkins professor of psychology? He and a gentleman, Lawrence Meyer, did, and this will be backwards in the video, but the New Atlantis, this is available online right now. They did a meta-analysis of sexuality and gender findings from the biological, psychological, and social sciences. And I would recommend everybody look that up. And they went back through the data and showed that yet there's still a mystery, that the genetic and biological contributions that so-called causes are really fluffy when you look down.
Hmm.
Like you can't use, there's no genetic, one gene or group of genes. You can't use genes to predict that somebody's going to experience same-sex attraction. There is higher percentages of people that experience same-sex attraction that have experienced sexual abuse in their backgrounds. I happen to be one of the exceptions to that. There's a lot of domestic abuse in households that they were raised in, divorce, higher than the general population that doesn't identify as LGBTQ. So is same-sex attraction a result of, like, is it a coping mechanism? Is it a body dysmorphia issue? There's an argument that can be made for these types of things, but it's really, I think there's more different, instead of seeing homosexuality as this one thing, and just in my experience and the reading I've done, it's more like there's different homosexualities, like kind of broad categories that people fit in, and choice can be more relevant in different cases. You really have to break it down.
Hmm.
It's just a complex question. Like someone that's, like my personality contributes. I might have some kind of hormonal or genetic bent towards that. Just like there's alcoholism in my family, I'm probably more likely to be alcoholic. I just happen to have never drank, but I'm
Hmm.
probably more susceptible to becoming an alcoholic because there's that wired connect. That's a much more simple chemical formula
Yeah.
where it's like this is a chemical that you insert and it's not involving relationships and that kind of stuff like alcoholism would be.
Another thing that I hear from my master's program and kind of generally in the world of psychology is that applying therapy or counseling to try to reverse someone's same-sex attraction is abusive. What do you think of that
Yep.
claim?
I think that's bunk. Now, if you're talking about electric shocks, if you're talking about any kind of aversion or negative reinforcement, which again, the majority of the studies in the APA report involve that kind of stuff, noxious stimuli. If you look at the um, types of things that they would use a nausea-inducing medication and then show somebody same-sex porn to try to get them to change. Yes, that's abusive, but do churches do that? Do Christian ministries do that? No. Do most counselors with any kind of common sense and decency do that? No. It that's whenever I see someone that says, abusive or counseling is not beneficial, or abusive, I want to know, what are they talking about specifically? What's the therapeutic modality? Like, because that's the argument, that's the level of the argument that's being challenged in the Supreme Court, is that kind of everything's thrown together as conversion therapy, and there's no discernment as to the quality or methodology being used, and it's all being labeled as abusive just on principle. And I'm like, I wasn't abused in the kind of counseling and therapy I went through. So, and it was just regular conversations, exploring parts of my background or where I'm at now with my relationships. And it was exploratory in nature. That's not abusive. So anyone that just they're trying to get you to not think or to only think. The APA constantly emphasizes those old abusive practices of the past and never discusses what talk therapy could actually be. So I just find that horribly unfair.
Wow. And so we've been talking about same-sex attraction so far, but a lot of these principles also apply to issues of gender identity.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
And this is where we see, the same game plan that was really found to be successful in people who identify as gay or lesbian making strides. The same game plan was glommed onto by those who identify as transgender. So affirmation therapy was mandated, where you can't try to change somebody's orientation because that's just the worst thing possible, because it's impossible.
So gender affirming care originally came from gay affirming care.
It's using the exact same playbook and phrases, and people don't want to be called homophobic, and that fear was the worst thing. And when I grew up, homophobia was not a word that you ever heard. The fear was being called gay or lesbians. Now, with some good, I mean, I'm glad we're not living the way we used to, because it was not fun being afraid of being labeled as a lesbian in the time when I was growing up. And I don't want to dismiss that fear. And there was a lot of courage by people who identify as gay and lesbian to stand up, and the culture has changed in many ways for the better, but not to the point that we demonize people who have any kind of question about, is fluidity and orientation possible? Well, now you're shouted out down as you're homophobic. The only reason, so the same thing, that same playbook, we hear transphobia, again, a word I didn't hear when I was growing up. We didn't hear it 10 years ago, whatever. The same kind of, we don't want to be fear of being phobic, which is a clinical phobia, has now been watered down. It's like an irrational fear of something is what a phobia is. Everybody on the planet is irrational to question these ideas. So with gender, that's part of what's really going to press forward in the Supreme Court decision, is that anything other than gender, affirming somebody's idea about who they truly are on the inside, in spite of what their bodies are telling everybody and themselves, that inability to reconcile with who you are created to be biologically, it's abusive to try to help somebody do anything other than affirm their mental impression of who they are. So same thing. It's the same categorical error. And to me, it's not just to me. It's not therapy to affirm somebody. That's not a therapeutic intervention. That's just a pat on the head. So the APA describes, therapeutic coping mechanisms, teaching people that, and that's what's supposed to be therapy. And I'm like, that's not, anyone can teach somebody how to cope. That's not a therapeutic modality or intervention. And it's so glaringly obvious in the case of a mental health condition, when someone has a body dysmorphia that's that severe that they're wanting to transform their body by taking wrong sex hormones or having surgery to appear as the other sex, when that's what's not possible. It's not possible to change your sex, and it's not helpful in the long run. Dr. Paul McHugh was instrumental in helping to shut down the transgender clinic at Johns Hopkins years ago when it was working. He's really good at finding a kind of whistleblowing and debunking. He helped, I think he was helpful in multiple personality disorder craze that was going on, and he did a lot of work on that area too, to kind of say this isn't really what everybody's, he kind of worked on shutting down trends.
It seems really bizarre to me that you have someone with this kind of body dysmorphia, this gender issue that's kind of going on, and it's considered abusive to question that in any way. But giving them hormones and surgeries that mutilate their body is considered appropriate care. It seems kind of
Yes.
backwards in a sense.
It's wildly disingenuous and abusive. And it's, again, ultimately not helping people. Suicide attempts and etiology goes up in people that have had medicalization um, of hormones and or surgical treatments. So it's not helping to actually treat the core problem that they profess that it's supposed to be helping.
Tell me tell me about your organization, what they do.
So I write a newsletter called Resources for Redemption. It's a Christian perspective helping to equip and educate pastors, counselors, laypersons. I do a lot of just on sexuality and gender. So I do a lot of book reports. I'll do a lot of research into political, not as much political, but court cases like the Supreme Court findings, and kind of break that down. And I do look at the research in the field of psychology and try to break that down and explain it on a layperson's level to the best of my ability. It's from a journalist kind of perspective. There's tons of references, um, but it's trying to look through a redemptive lens. So I'm a Christian, and I believe that we can be reconciled to God. We can be reconciled to Him in every area of our lives, including sexuality and gender. I've come from a place, I didn't have clinical levels of gender dysphoria, but that's a common thread between same-sex attraction and insecurity or confusion, is that gender nonconforming type of appearance. You'll see that in both populations mentioned quite often, but that doesn't necessarily mean somebody is destined to be gay. I see that statistic kind of mentioned a lot, that if you're gender nonconforming, that means you're probably really gay or lesbian. And it's like, no, and not necessarily, although I do see more secular people starting to put that in there because they're recognizing that's putting somebody into a box. I think it's really wrong to label a child with any kind of sexual orientation label or trans type of label. They're too young to make either of those decisions. And again, the research has pointed out, and Dr. Lisa Diamond has pointed out, that the only way to know if somebody's same-sex attractions in their youth will linger into their adulthood is to just wait and find out if that actually happens. Because statistically, the evidence she's seen for fluidity is way stronger than so just because you're attracted to the same sex, even as as your as a teenager, doesn't mean that that's going to last into adulthood. Not saying that it's quote unquote just a phase, but it's saying that we need to keep an open future in mind for everyone, and labeling kids sexually or with a label that causes them to not understand or to take away from who they are biologically is really harmful. But again, it's glaringly obvious in the trans realm, where we see the surgery for someone that is in the sexual orientation kind of realm. Are you preventing somebody from being in a relationship with a complementary sex that could lead to marriage and having children? There's kind of a practical infertility you're kind of throwing on them, in a sense. And we don't know what somebody's life's going to be like long term, and we shouldn't be messing with that. Again, I'm thankful I didn't have somebody messing with that in my
Mm.
life growing up, that I was able to just kind of, again, I wish I had more information. I wish I had access to more resources, but I'm thankful I was able to kind of quietly think it through on my own too.
Do you feel like a lot of people, especially with the gender identity thing, are being coached into feeling a certain way or developing a certain identity or making certain decisions?
Totally. It's become a one size fits all type of answer, and we've seen this from the stories of a lot of kids that have detransitioned are saying that, I went in because I was confused about or I was having depression and I, didn't really like having a period or, you know, didn't want attraction from boys, and then trans was the answer. That's what that must mean. And I'm like, that is just absolutely irresponsible to throw that label around as a quick answer and then have a kid change their bodies and have permanent lasting results, like their voice is going to be changed for life, or they've had parts removed that, well, you just cannot replace. It's so irresponsible. That reconciling, this is a point I was thinking of earlier, reconciling that gender nonconformity I've seen that be beneficial. That was something I feel like helped me before I experienced attractions to men. Was not that I needed to go from being a super tomboy to super feminine, but just becoming more comfortable with who I was as a woman, I think was a precedent to kind of opening the door to attractions to men in my own life. And that's a safe, non-abusive thing to explore. Things like finding what colors work better for me and looking for clothes in the store that were not necessarily super frilly or feminine, but just kind of going in the women's section. Like if that's a royal blue or an emerald green, that color works good with my skin tone. So let me just try that. Like that made it more accessible than like I would not have wanted to go into the store and find something with floral, patterns, and like I own maybe one dress.
Hmm.
Like I, only wore it on special occasions. Now I wear dresses all the time and I'm like, I don't even think about it. And I get my nails done. And I would never in a million years have done that growing up. But we go backpacking, I go kayaking. I'm still very tomboyish in my activities, and almost all of my pictures with my husband, I realized we're always wearing either ski helmets or bike helmets or backpacking gear. I'm like, we've got to, sometime at Easter at church, we should get our picture taken because we don't look like we're just always outdoors all the time. And that's great. Like that's what we like to do. So I'm more like I can be super tomboyish, but I'm also again very comfortable with not just the outward, the clothes of being a woman, but I feel I've been able to enjoy being a woman, to realize that I have a unique perspective as a woman that I can add to and bring. Like I'm not jealous of men like I used to be. Um, I've just felt more at home in who I am as God's woman and not wanting those kind of elements. Again, they're undergirding some aspects of same-sex attraction for some people, and that's worth exploring to see, not just to see what, fluidity might experience, they might experience in their attractions, but just to kind of reconcile with who they are as a woman or as a man, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so you've got this fascinating story that defies kind of the accepted wisdom, and you do a lot of work on research and kind of counteracting what you see as narratives that are either not true or not helpful.
Mhm.
And you've got this kind of recent Supreme Court case coming up that is a lot of this is kind of all coming together. Tell me how you see that fleshing out.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that the case itself is based on free speech versus conduct. Is the and it's a woman in Colorado, young therapist, who says, this affirmation only approach is there's a ban in Colorado against using anything but affirmation only with young people. And she's like, I've got clients with unwanted same-sex attraction or unwanted gender dysphoria, and it's not fair for me to not be able to even mention or explore any kind of thing other than affirmation. Because that's not what the client wants. It's not something I agree with, and it shouldn't be constitutional. Now, there's A similar case in Florida went to their, I think it's the 11th district. There was a ban in a city in Florida, and the 11th district, they appealed up to that level and they won. So the ban against affirmation only, or the ban, excuse me, against anything but affirmation only was put down. So in Florida, and I guess any place in the 3rd district or the 11th district, you're allowed to use something other than affirmation only in counseling. But in other states like Colorado, that's not the case. So it's gone to the Supreme Court. And the issue is this a matter of conduct or free speech? So conduct would be because it's professional. The APA is insisting that this is professional therapy. Therefore, it should come under a medical type heading, that we're allowed to regulate a medical procedure. And the opposing case is you can't just, and it's been in several other court cases, you can't just label speech therapy. And so it comes under free speech. So that's where the battle is. And again, there are cases where the free speech side has won. And so I kind of wish it was a deeper, going into the actual research a little bit more instead of looking at free speech versus conduct. But there is precedence in the Supreme Court. There was a case in California that puts it more under the free speech. A medical clinic was being forced to, it was a pro-life group that was being forced to talk about the availability of abortion clinics in their area. And that came under a free speech versus conduct type of thing, and they won their case. I don't know if that's as closely related as I've heard some people say it is, but it does provide, some of the arguments were similar, and it does provide some type of precedent to put this under a free speech issue. Liberty Counsel has submitted an affidavit, an amicus brief that talks about the research that the APA has, done. It breaks it down and it shows that this research for sexual orientation is not as thorough as the APA is saying. And so I'm thrilled that that's getting thrown in there. But again, with the case of gender, it's blaringly, blatantly obvious that this is harmful to children, to only allow them to be encouraged to have surgery or hormones instead of dealing with their body dysmorphia in a therapeutic manner.
It seems odd that you say, let's say an adult, for instance, you should be able to, consenting adults should be able to do what they want with their own bodies, up to and including, hormones, surgeries, removal of body parts, but you should not be able to consent to talk therapy that would challenge these ideas, right? That seems odd.
Yes. And again, to kind of paint it and throw it all in as being abusive. And it's like, what do you mean by that? What examples are you giving? Are you giving examples from something that it reminds me of some of the talks that you've had, interviews you've had, where people are giving these crazy examples of something being said that's blatantly racist that nobody would ever, say or use. And it's like, well, you can't just say that this whole entire field is abusive when you're talking about examples that are bizarre. Like,
Outliers.
nobody does electric shock.
Yeah.
Nobody's making somebody, take something to make them nauseous and watch porn and think that that's therapy. Now, if you want to outlaw those, like outlaw aversion therapy, go for it. You should, coercion should be outlawed. Well, it kind of is, already, like, coercion is unethical. We all know that. But that's where the APA has overstepped its bounds, where it's just saying it's wrong on principle and not on, when you actually look at in practice, we're not talking about the same thing. So yes, there are, and that's what I'm hoping the Supreme Court will see, is that this is viewpoint discrimination. This is not a therapeutic harm that we're trying to outlaw. You're trying to outlaw the ability for anybody to have a different perspective. or point of view in a professional environment. And that's what's going on. Like when the APA, they did a new study that they put out in 2021, and on sexual orientation efforts, and they said, well, there's no new research that's showing anything different from our task force report in 2009. And I'm like, well, duh, no, because you've suppressed anybody's ability to do any research or do any counseling in this
Mm.
area. So of course you're not going to have any new findings when you've kind of professionally made it against their standard of care. Like that's just, again, completely unfair. There's plenty safe, responsible, um, worthy, like I feel like the whole field of science has missed out on learning more about human sexuality by not talking to people like myself who've experienced that kind of fluidity and benefited from a therapeutic environment. I'd love to get a group of counselors together to go through what modalities were helpful for me. Some of the exercises I did or questions, and a lot of it was open-ended questions, and some of it's I think a lot of it's personally tailored. And I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know all the names of all the, is it cognitive behavioral or whatever.
Could you
But
describe some of those modalities a little bit?
yeah, so one of the things, like when I went into one-on-one counseling with a gentleman, I wanted to find a male counselor because I felt kind of stuck. Like I wasn't attracted to women per se anymore, but I wasn't really attracted to men. I had healthy friendships with women, but I wasn't moving forward in relationships with guys. So I kind of felt stuck, like I'm in this kind of neutral zone. And I just wanted to explore, I'm like, is there something I can be doing that I could change to help me move forward from this kind of stage? So I wanted to have a male counselor because I'm working on trying to, work in that direction. And he listened. He had a hard time trying to find the code because at that point there wasn't, like, unwanted same-sex attraction was not in the DSM as
Mm.
a diagnosis code. So I remember him talking out loud and kind of going, well, I can't put it here, and I could find it. Like he was trying to figure out creative ways to
Mm.
code for it. But we found something. I can't remember exactly which ones he picked. But one of the things he suggested was, why don't you write a poll for like I could write up the poll questions and give it out to the male friends and relatives I had just to kind of learn more about what life was like from their perspective. And I called it the man poll. And it was really a fun, creative thing to do. So I put in a bunch of like questions that were meaningful to me that I wanted to ask guys, but never would have the courage to do. But I interspersed it with questions about sports or cars or something to kind of purposefully be stereotypical just to kind of mess with them because they're guys and they all kind of got, like, I'm very sarcastic. So they all kind of got it and thought it was funny. And I think one of the questions was, what was the score of last week's Steelers game? And one of the guys is like, they lost. Ha! Aren't you sad that you asked this question? It was really funny. Anyway, but some of the questions I remember, the last two were, what's the best part about being a guy and what's the worst part about being a guy? And they all answered the same, that the best part was that it had to do with high and low expectations. Like the worst part of being a guy is sometimes, or usually, people will just expect them to do something, be able to do something or achieve something because they're a guy. Like the car's broken down on the side of the road. You should be able to fix it because you're the guy. And they might not have a clue what to do, So
Mm.
like that was the hardest part of being a guy, is having expectations put on them. And the best part of being a guy was having sometimes low expectations put on them because they were like, if there's cookies that need to be made for the kids' school tomorrow, no one's going to ask them because they're a guy. Like that kind of, it
Mm.
was low
Hmm.
expectations, some kind of version of low expectations or high expectations. And I had never thought of that before. And it was really revealing that all of them gave some kind of answer in that same. So again, I was just gleaning and learning insights from a man's perspective and how that's different from maybe some of the stereotypes or fears I had to sort through. So like that was just a really fun, good challenge for me and turned out to be a funny, fun exercise to do. So things like that. And I'm like, nothing abusive about that suggestion or the, like, I have no clue how that could be seen as abusive. Another thing, this wasn't necessarily an exercise. I don't know where I got this idea from, but I did this, and this is really old because the tape is old on this, but I did something I called feeding the you. And I put you as EWE, like a female sheep, because I'm a Christian and I thought that would be hilarious.
Hmm.
So I just started collecting quotes, poems, lyrics, anything that kind of struck me like as potentially like maybe it's like an attracted to men kind of thing, kind of sparked that in me, or something that kind of sparked embracing femininity in my own life. And I can't remember if that was an exercise suggestion or if I just started doing that. And some of these are quotes from books. Some of it's like the description of Goldberry in The Lord of the Rings. I'm a huge C.S. Lewis and
Hmm.
Tolkien fan. That there was just a dignity in how Tolkien described Goldberry and the beauty of it that isn't that kind of sometimes hyper femininity or femininity can have some really negative aspects and qualities to it that just turn me off.
Hmm.
But the description in Tolkien of Goldberry was something that turned me like I could aspire to that.
Hmm.
That I could not necessarily well, kind of relate to or just made femininity more accessible to me and more desirable for me, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So kind of nurturing femininity, but also whatever sparks of attractions that would help me see guys differently just as people that would kind of open up that door towards attractions was just, and I cherish this little notebook, and looking back, I'm like, man, that was really helpful to kind of realize that there is something in my own heart. It might be distant or kind of, it's so easy to just kind of brush that stuff off.
Hmm.
But instead, I made a point to write it down um,
Let me
and
let me
think
ask
on it
you.
more.
Yeah, you seem to sit in a very uncomfortable place. So, like within like the Christian church, there's a strong taboo against same-sex attraction, and in a lot of secular America, there would be a strong taboo against kind of challenging that in any way. And so you kind of sit in this place where it seems like pretty much from any angle, this would be an uncomfortable place to sit in. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for recognizing that. It's changed a lot. It's been wild to see how, because I've lived through society where there was too much negativity towards anyone that identified as LGBT to now it's like super celebrated and super hyped. And I'm like, I felt like it's just jumped over persons like myself, where it's like you either hate and like you're fearful of being labeled as gay or lesbian, and now you're like, I'm a social pariah because I don't celebrate that.
Mm,
Like, what? There's these extremes, and no one's even thought about people that experienced those feel, because it's a unique feeling, and there's not a lot of people in the population that know what it's like to be attracted to the same sex. Lots of people now identify in that venue, but it's not all that the majority of the people that experience that. But to me, it's just a temptation. And in the church, I've found a lot of improvements for the better, although it's still not preached about enough on Sunday mornings because pastors feel terrified. Um, again, they've kind of felt like they've gone through that same, a lot of them have gone through that same major change in society, and maybe they've never spent time, looking into it that deeply. Pastors are, to me, they're like doctors. They have to deal with a lot of issues and can only specialize so much if you're a general practitioner. So they're afraid of saying the wrong thing um, for one reason or the other. I do find there's so much more compassion and than there used to be in the church environment. I found I love talking to church groups and answering questions. I've not had many negative experiences, thanks be to God. Years ago, When I wrote another newsletter in the early days of the internet, I got some hate mail that was hilarious. So somebody had sent me a poster that had pictures of guys in swimsuits, and then they had cut out from magazines, and they had cut out little headlines that said, something that said, "You think this guy's really attractive, you think this guy's really hot." And I was like, that's weird. Okay. Yeah, I kind of think that guy is attractive. And why am I getting this? And I realized somebody thought that I was a guy writing about leaving homosexuality behind in pursuit of Christ and meant to send me this poster to say, no,
Mm.
you're really, but they didn't
Mm.
realize that I was a girl. I was a woman. So I was like, it was kind of affirming for me. And it was hilarious. And I'm like, this poor guy or girl, I was pretty assuming it was a guy who sent it. So I called a friend of mine. I'm like, should I send them a letter back and say thank you? Or should like, what should I? And we just kind of left it alone because it was kind of a win-win.
Mm.
They thought that they sent this thing and put me in my place, and I thought that guy was cute on the poster. So yes, it was hilarious. So I've not had very many bad personal
That's
experiences,
good.
but I've had, it is now to me, it's so I write about it so much and I talk to so many people in churches and one-on-one situations that to me it's kind of like I don't you know I don't really care that much anymore. But growing up with that kind of pressure and hiding, and when I started to find books that I considered decent books, I used to hide them. Did some internships as part of my education and stayed with a family, for instance, and I kept them in a suitcase so they couldn't see my books. And now I've got bookshelves all over. Like I love having, there's so many resources that are good, solid, helpful. I wish there was more in the realm of professional counseling where you all could be free to think through these things and explore these ideas and really help people, whether they're Christians or not, who have that just want to explore sexuality. And it is safe for clinicians to do that with clients. And I'm sure that there are a lot of clinicians doing this with clients behind the scenes, just finding creative ways to do it. Um, it should be researched more. It should be
Mm.
discussed more. It shouldn't be just thrown, into back corners. It's ridiculous to have that kind of, again, viewpoint discrimination thrown out. That to me, well, not just to me, but it's harming people for finding just resolution with tension in their lives if they want to learn more about their sexuality or reconcile with their
Wow. There's so many fascinating, interesting things that I just honestly have never thought about. And I thank you for kind of illuminating some of that for me. I have one final question that I ask for all the guests on my podcast, and that is just in society more broadly, what is one thing that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
It's an excellent question. I think one foundational thing going on in society that we should talk about more is fatherlessness and just the need to encourage young men about what a blessing and challenge fatherhood is, because it's so easy for a guy to just walk away. Um, it's so easy to, like no fault divorce is another thing. That's, yes, we should make divorce impossible when there are cases of abuse, but there's many ways where no fault divorce was a precedent for this whole um, dismembering of sexuality and gender and families. And it made fatherlessness a much easier thing to do, much greater possibility in a young man's life if they could just walk away from their responsibilities. And the data now about how many issues like depression and economic status and just so many areas of a person's life can be tied to crime, imprisonment, can be tied to fatherlessness. It's wild. But again, I don't see, like, all these sitcoms have dads that are schmucks and schmoes that are just goofballs. And you don't see, not that everything should be back to father knows best and leave it to beaver, but like Little House on the Prairie. And now, of course, Charles was kind of, when I look back at Charles Ingalls, if you've not seen that show, I've looked back at some episodes and like he solved a lot of problems by punching somebody. He did that a little too much, but just the strength in that family unit. I used to watch that and just go, man, what would that be like? I would not have wanted to be one of the girls because they wore dresses all the time and those horrible shoes, and I would have probably been really uncomfortable living in that day. But to have a dad that would come home every day, because we were early latchkey kids, um, and just the impact of having a dad in the home. Girls have their periods start earlier in homes without a father.
Hmm.
Like that's radically weird. Like a year earlier. So it's crazy how much of an impact that can have. And I don't know if they know the mechanism for that, but it's the data is, and out of wedlock pregnancies increase for girls that have had no father in the home. So, but the importance of how critical it is for guys to know that fatherhood is a gift and a blessing and a great responsibility, and staying there with their mom, the mother of their children, and raising a family, and how huge that can, usually that can benefit, like such a powerful way to change culture and improve society on so many different levels. So it's a great weight and privilege and responsibility that guys can grow into. And I'd love to see that emphasized more.
That was a fascinating, phenomenal answer, and it's so true. It has such a huge impact in our society, and I really appreciate you saying that. Deborah, where can people find you?
Yeah. So on Substack, it's resources, the number 4 and redemption on Substack. And then my email is resources, the number 4 and the letter R. So resources4r@gmail.com. So if people have questions, or again, I speak at churches that when I mention that uh, sexual orientation doesn't hold up theologically, philosophically, or scientifically, I do a hour-long presentation explaining that. And the same for gender ideology, where I've got slides that show all the data and a lot of the resources that I talked about today. And so people are interested in learning more, churches, or if any, I'm so thrilled that you're doing this, Ryan. This is such a gift and so needed to allow counselors, therapists to have a chance to just discuss how they've been ripped off in their education, and how these ideologies, to see that this affirmation only approach is spreading throughout all of psychology is blowing my mind. So I'm so thankful you're giving people a voice, because it's robbing people of the richness of an entire field of education. A entire field, a profession is getting stripped of its usefulness, utility, with these theories just taking over, and it's just so vapid. It's mindless. So I'm thrilled that you are doing this work, and keep up the good work and interviewing counselors. I don't see anyone else doing this type of thing, and it's really needed.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I love talking to you. I love the insights that you brought to me, illuminated some new things for me, as I said. If you'll stick around for just a moment until the upload finishes, love talking to you, and I'll have to talk to you again sometime.
Thanks so much.